All right, welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. We're going to be taking a pretty in-depth look today at something that I think affects all of us in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that is what happens when our hearts, they run into trouble,
Yeah.
whether it's problems with the blood supply or the electrical system,
Right.
all that stuff that keeps it ticking.
Yeah. No, the heart's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're going to be taking a deep dive today into those topics. The information we'll be looking at is, pulled straight from medical textbooks, your
Yeah.
classic sort of stuff. We've also got some good slideshows. Visuals always help. Really gives a solid understanding, when you can kind of see what's going on.
Absolutely, yeah, being able to visualize it. Because I think that's our goal for today. I mean, it's a pretty complex topic, right?
Oh, yeah.
But we want to make it so that anyone listening today can really understand, what we're talking about when we talk about angina, heart attacks, even those like heart rhythm problems, right?
Yes.
Which I think can get really confusing.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, VTach, VFib, all those things.
And they all sound kind of similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to cut through all the jargon, make it so that you can grasp this stuff quickly without it making your head spin.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's
Let's unpack this.
yeah, let's unpack this. And I think it makes sense to just start with the term angina pectoris. I think that's probably a good place to begin, right?
Absolutely. Angina is definitely a key term to understand right off the bat. And, one thing that our sources made clear is that it's not actually a disease, it's more a symptom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so think of it as like your heart muscle is trying to send out an SOS, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, something's wrong. And that signal usually, presents itself as chest pain or some kind of discomfort.
Okay.
And what it's basically telling us is that there's this thing called myocardial ischemia going on. And all that means is that there's not enough oxygen-rich blood getting to the heart muscle.
So it's like saying, "Hey, I'm running low on fuel over here."
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, so we get that we get the angina. Now the lack of fuel, like you're talking about, that can show up in a few different ways, right?
Yeah.
The sources, they talk about stable angina, unstable, and then there's that variant angina.
You got it. So yeah, let's break those down a little bit.
Okay.
So let's start with stable angina. This is like the predictable kind. You might notice it, if you're out for a run
Okay.
or you're doing something, active, maybe lifting weights, something like that.
Working hard.
Yeah. Or maybe even if you're just under a lot of emotional stress,
Oh yeah.
things like that. But the really important thing here with stable angina is it's predictable, right? So it usually goes away once you rest a little bit. Or, sometimes people take a medication called nitroglycerin, and that helps. And it tends to be fairly short-lived, just a few minutes usually. Now, the reason we're, putting so much emphasis on this predictability aspect is because it's really important for you to be aware of any deviation from that normal pattern.
Oh, okay.
Right. So if you start noticing that it's happening more frequently, the pain is more intense, or maybe it's happening when you're just sitting there reading a book,
Yeah.
at rest,
Yeah.
that's a huge red flag. And it could potentially mean that it's progressed to unstable angina.
Okay, so stable angina is like the warning, like predictable warning
Right.
when the heart's working a little harder. And then unstable angina, that sounds a lot more serious.
That is.
Just because of the unpredictability.
Yeah, and that's a good way to think about it. Unstable angina is much more concerning because, like you said, it can happen even when you're just chilling on the couch,
Yeah.
just relaxing. It also, tends to be more severe and it lasts longer than stable angina. And here's where it gets, really, really important. Unstable angina is considered a medical emergency because it could be a sign that you're about to have a heart attack.
Oh, wow.
So it's like, it's a critical warning sign. It's not something to mess around with. It needs immediate medical attention.
Yeah, that really highlights why knowing the difference,
Yeah.
between those two
Yeah.
is so important. And then there's that third one, the variant angina,
Right.
or Prinzmetal's angina.
Right.
And that one, the cause is actually quite different, right?
It is. Variant angina is, well, it's not usually caused by the typical blockages that we think of when we talk about heart problems.
Yeah.
Instead, it's triggered by a sudden spasm in one of the coronary arteries.
Oh, okay.
And those are the vessels that supply blood to the heart.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about this one is that it often happens when you're at rest,
Really?
frequently at night or early in the morning.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that weird?
That's interesting.
So the good news, though, is that it usually responds well to a different kind of medication, like calcium channel blockers. Those help to relax those arteries. So that's variant angina. A little less common, but still important to be aware of because, the treatment approach is different.
Yeah. Okay. So
Mm.
we've got the pain that's linked to, kind of predictable exertion.
Yeah.
Then we've got unpredictable pain, which is like a major warning sign.
Yeah.
And then we have the pain that's caused by the spasms, often at rest. So that gives us like a good handle on the different types of angina.
Right.
But how does it actually feel? Like we know it's chest pain, but I know it can show up in other ways too, right?
Yeah, yeah. So chest pressure, right? That's a common one.
Okay.
Or, maybe feels like tightness, squeezing, even like a burning sensation.
Oh, wow.
Those are all, common ways that people describe it. But here's the thing, that pain can actually radiate out to other areas too.
Oh,
So your shoulders, your arms, your neck, jaw, or even your back. Yeah, it's pretty crazy, right? And what's really fascinating about that is it shows us how interconnected our nervous system is.
right.
Like we think of pain as being very localized, but it's not always that simple. And so, with angina, you can also have other symptoms too, along with the pain, like shortness of breath, nausea, feeling really tired, sweaty.
Oh, wow.
So it's not always just straightforward pain in the chest.
Right.
And that's why, for you, it's so important to be aware of the whole range of potential signs.
Yeah, definitely good to know like how far that discomfort can reach. Okay, so we've talked about angina, the signal of, not enough blood flow.
Right.
What happens when it becomes a complete blockage?
Oh, yeah. Then we're talking about a myocardial infarction,
Okay.
or, what we commonly call a heart attack.
A heart attack.
That's right. And that happens when, there's a blockage in one or more of the coronary arteries. And usually the most common culprit is that buildup of fatty deposits. That process called atherosclerosis.
Right.
But you can also have blood clots or even other things that cause this blockage.
Okay.
But the main consequence of an MI is that it reduces, or even completely stops the blood flow to a part of the heart tissue.
Right.
And so when that tissue doesn't get the oxygen that it needs, it starts to become damaged.
Yeah, and this damage, like that can lead to some really serious issues. I mean, this sources go into, a lot of detail about all the things that can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I found really interesting is that an MI can actually cause problems with the heart's electrical activity too.
Oh, okay.
It can lead to those dysrhythmias that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
And, aside from that, the sources also mention other potential complications that can happen after a heart attack.
Oh, okay.
Like one is you might hear a heart murmur, and that basically means there's some backflow or turbulent blood flow in the heart valves.
Okay.
Then there's stenosis, where the valves become stiff. Mm-hmm.
And they don't open and close properly.
Yeah.
I remember when I was reading through the source material, there's this one thing that really stood out to me, and it was a papillary muscle rupture.
Oh, yeah.
Have you heard of that?
Yeah, that sounds pretty severe.
It is. So basically, the papillary muscles are these little muscles that help control the heart valves.
Okay.
And if one of them ruptures, well, it can lead to something called mitral insufficiency.
Okay.
And that means the mitral valve doesn't close properly. So the blood starts leaking backwards.
Oh, wow.
Then you've got thromboembolism, where a blood clot breaks off and travels to another part of the body
Mm-hmm.
and, causes another blockage somewhere else.
Yeah.
Then there's pericarditis. And that's inflammation of the sac that surrounds the heart. And of course, an MI can lead to heart failure. And that's where, the heart muscle becomes too weak to pump blood effectively throughout the body.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to understand that heart failure doesn't mean that the heart has stopped working completely. Right.
It just means that its pumping action is significantly weakened.
Okay.
And then in the most severe cases, an MI can actually result in something called cardiogenic shock.
Oh, wow.
And that's life-threatening, The heart suddenly can't pump enough blood to meet the body's needs.
Yeah.
So what's really insightful here is that you can see how, this one blockage can just kind of cascade into this whole range of problems, It really highlights how delicate the balance is in the heart and how interconnected everything is.
Yeah, absolutely. Really paints a picture of why it's so critical to keep that heart healthy.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered the fuel part, the blood supply, and what happens when that goes wrong.
Yeah.
Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the heart's electrical system.
Yeah.
And I actually found in the slideshow, they had this comparison to a house with lights turning on and off.
Yeah, I saw that too.
And I thought that was super helpful in just like visualizing how it works.
Yeah.
So do you think maybe we could go through that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the heart's ability to contract and pump blood, it all comes down to this really precise electrical system. So, like you said, thinking of it like a house, with lights turning on and off in a very specific sequence, that's a good analogy.
Okay.
So when a heart muscle cell gets stimulated, it generates an electrical signal,
Okay.
and that's called an action potential.
Mm-hmm.
And this action potential, it leads to the cell contracting. So that's the depolarization phase.
Okay.
And then you've got repolarization, and that's when the cell goes back to its resting state and gets ready for the next beat.
Got it.
So it's essentially this very precise, like, dance
Yeah.
of electrically charged particles moving in and out of the heart cells. And that's what creates those electrical impulses. And the textbook actually goes into, some specifics
Oh, yeah.
about which particles are involved, like, sodium and potassium, and how they move. So it gets a little bit more technical.
Right. But I think the main idea, is depolarization.
Yeah.
Is like the on switch, right?
Yes, exactly.
It's causing that contraction.
Yeah.
And then repolarization is like the off switch,
Yeah.
allowing the heart to rest and recharge.
Exactly.
Now, let's take that light switch idea and apply it to the atria and the ventricles.
Right. So atrial depolarization is like turning on the first set of lights.
Okay.
So we're talking about the lights in the top chambers of our heart house,
Yeah.
which are the atria.
The atria.
Right. So this electrical signal, it tells the atria to squeeze
Okay.
and push all the blood down into the ventricles,
Okay.
which are those bottom chambers of the heart.
Right.
Now, if we look at an EKG, right,
Mhm.
an electrocardiogram, this electrical activity shows up as what's called the P wave. And it's that small, like, upward blip
Okay.
that you see on the EKG tracing.
Got it. Yeah.
So that P wave, a little blip, that's the atria getting ready.
Getting ready. Yeah.
Right. Now, what about when the ventricles get their signal?
Right. Right.
That was described as the big switch.
Yeah. That's the main event.
That's a main event, yeah. Ventricular depolarization is like flipping the main power switch
Okay.
and lighting up the bottom rooms, those ventricles. And this is a much stronger electrical event
Right.
because the ventricles, remember, they're the ones that are pumping blood out to the lungs and the rest of the body.
Yeah. The heavy lifting.
Yeah, exactly. So they need a much more forceful contraction.
Right.
And on the EKG, you see this as what's called the QRS complex.
Okay.
And that's the biggest part of the tracing.
Right.
Because it represents that really powerful electrical surge that's happening in the ventricles.
Okay. So we've got the P wave for the atria squeeze.
Yeah,
And then we've got the big QRS for the powerful ventricle squeeze.
you got it.
What happens after that big squeeze?
Right.
Because that's where the charging the battery part comes in, right?
Exactly. So after the ventricles contract, they have to relax. They have to recharge so they can be ready for the next beat.
Right.
So ventricular repolarization is like turning those big lights back off.
Okay.
So the system can kind of reset. The battery can recharge.
Okay.
And on the EKG, this shows up as what's called the T wave.
So just to summarize in really simple terms, like how the source put it, atrial depolarization.
Yeah.
The top part gets ready to squeeze.
Yeah.
Ventricular depolarization, the bottom part squeezes hard.
Right.
And then ventricular repolarization, the bottom part rests and gets ready again.
You got it.
It's beautiful how it all works together.
It is. And for those who are interested, the textbook also mentions, the specific phases of this action potential.
Oh, yeah?
So like phase 0, that's when these fast sodium channels open up.
Okay.
And that causes that really rapid rise in electrical activity that we call depolarization. And then in phase 3, that's repolarization.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens because potassium ions exit the cells.
Right.
So it's this very precise, balance of these charged particles moving across the heart cell membranes
Yeah.
that creates these really essential electrical events.
It's amazing how it all comes down to these tiny, cellular changes.
Right.
Now, what happens when this perfectly timed, orchestrated electrical system goes off key?
Yeah. Well, then we start talking about dysrhythmias
Okay.
or heart rhythm disorder.
And the source, uses a pretty strong term to describe these,
Oh, yeah.
calling them very deadly.
Yeah. And that might sound, a little bit dramatic,
Right.
but it's a really important point to understand.
Okay.
Because dysrhythmias, they can be extremely serious.
Yeah.
And, the reason for that is because the heart's pumping action, it's directly controlled by these electrical signals.
Right.
So when there's disruptions, it can have some really serious consequences. ineffective blood pumping,
Yeah.
and even cardiac arrest.
Oh, wow.
So that's why the source really emphasizes, the need for immediate cardiac monitoring when a dysrhythmia is suspected.
So it's not just, the rhythm is a little off.
Yeah,
It's really about, like, can the heart pump effectively?
exactly. That's the key thing.
Right. And the sources go into, a few specific types of dysrhythmias.
Yeah.
So let's maybe start with atrial fibrillation or AFib.
Okay. So atrial fibrillation, what happens there is you don't have those nice coordinated rhythmic contractions in the atria.
Okay.
So instead of a nice organized squeeze, the atria are basically just quivering, really rapidly and erratically.
Okay.
And on an EKG, this shows up as, a bunch of irregular little waves.
Okay.
They're called fibrillatory P waves.
Mm-hmm.
And that represents those rapid, disorganized electrical impulses that are just kind of like going all over the place in the atria.
So it's not, it's not contracting smoothly.
No, not at all. Some people describe it as like a bag of worms
Oh, wow.
instead of a nice coordinated muscle contraction.
Yeah, yeah. A quivering top chamber.
Yeah.
That really gives a good mental picture.
Right.
Okay, now what about ventricular fibrillation or VFib?
Okay, yeah.
That sounds even more critical,
It is.
especially when you think about its connection to that T wave.
Right, right. So ventricular fibrillation, this one is super dangerous.
Right.
And it's often triggered by something called a premature ventricular contraction. You might hear it called a PVC.
Okay.
It's basically an extra heartbeat
Okay.
that originates in the ventricles.
Right.
But the problem is these PVCs, they can sometimes land right on the T wave of a previous normal heartbeat.
Okay, and the T wave, that's the repolarization.
Right, that's the repolarization. So it's like this vulnerable period
Okay.
where the ventricles are still resetting.
Right.
They shouldn't be stimulated too early, but if a strong impulse like a PVC hits during this vulnerable phase, well, it can just throw the ventricles into this chaotic, quivering state
Oh, wow.
where they're not contracting effectively at all.
Okay.
So, they're not pumping blood like they should be. And the EKG, when you see ventricular fibrillation, it just shows these bizarre, irregular waves. There's no clear P waves, QRS complexes, or T waves.
Right.
It's just, the ventricle is basically just twitching.
Wow.
It's not pumping. And that's, that's why it's a life-threatening emergency.
Yeah.
So understanding the T wave, as that kind of reset period, that's really important for understanding why an early extra beat can be so disruptive.
Yeah, it makes that T wave sound like a really critical point
It is.
in the heart's electrical cycle.
It is.
And then there's ventricular tachycardia, VTach.
Right.
How does that one differ from VFib?
Okay, so ventricular tachycardia it's a rapid series of ventricular contractions,
Okay.
but it's often more organized than VFib. Okay.
At least initially.
Right.
And it's defined as VT that lasts longer than 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Or, it's associated with what's called hemodynamic compromise.
Mm-hmm.
And for you listening, think of hemodynamic compromise as basically meaning that the heart's not pumping enough blood
Okay.
to maintain your normal blood pressure and oxygen delivery to the rest of the body.
Yeah.
And so that's what makes it dangerous.
Right.
The EKG, when you have VT, you'll see a series of widened QRS waves.
Okay.
And they're happening really rapidly,
Mhm.
greater than 100 beats per minute.
Okay.
And there aren't any P waves before them or T waves after them.
Right.
The main issue here is that even though the ventricles are contracting rapidly, they're often not doing it effectively.
Okay.
So your cardiac output, how much blood your heart's actually pumping, that's severely reduced.
So it's like it's beating fast, but it's not doing a good job of actually moving the blood.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's kind of like, a car spinning its wheels.
Yeah.
So lots of activity,
Yeah.
but not going anywhere.
Right.
So we've got fast but ineffective in VTach,
Yeah.
and then completely chaotic and ineffective in VFib.
Right.
Now, the last one is asystole.
Systole.
And that's probably the one that, people are most familiar with from, medical dramas and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sadly, asystole it's the most serious one
Okay.
because it means there's no electrical activity in the heart
Wow.
at all. So no tissue contraction,
Okay.
no blood flow.
Right.
It's, it's the most severe form of cardiac arrest, and it's often irreversible. And that's what you see on the EKG as a flat line.
A flat line. Yeah.
Yeah.
The complete absence of electrical activity. That really illustrates, just how serious
Yeah.
these different rhythm problems can be.
Yeah, it's a wide spectrum, right? Each of these dysrhythmias is kind of like a different way
Yeah.
that the heart's electrical system can malfunction.
Yeah. And, with varying degrees of severity, different underlying mechanisms.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive
Mm-hmm.
into what happens when the heart, runs into
Yeah.
these big challenges.
Yeah.
And I think just to recap, the key things that we've talked about today.
Mm-hmm.
Angina is often a warning sign.
Right.
It's telling us there's not enough blood flow
Yeah.
to the heart muscle.
Yeah.
Then we have the heart attack, the myocardial infarction, the MI.
Right.
That's the actual blockage of blood flow,
Right.
which can lead to damage and all those other problems we talked about.
Absolutely.
And then the dysrhythmias.
Yeah.
Those are the disruptions in the electrical signals.
Right.
And that can really mess with the heart's ability to pump effectively.
Yeah.
And I think, for anyone listening today, understanding those basic concepts is so important.
It is.
Just for being, well informed about your own heart health
Absolutely.
and the health of the people around you.
Yeah. And we really hope that this deep dive has given you, a clear understanding of all these important concepts without, making things too overwhelming.
Yeah, hopefully we didn't overload you with information.
Right.
But I think, when you think about how incredibly complex and delicate,
Mm-hmm.
all this interplay is
Mm-hmm.
between the heart's electrical and circulatory systems,
Yeah.
it really makes you wonder what other seemingly small disruptions,
Yeah.
could have these big impacts on our overall health.
Right.
And it's definitely something to think about
It is.
as we all continue to, explore the wonders of the human body.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you later.